The moment I sat down at the wedding table, I saw the name tag. It was small, cream-colored, perfectly printed. Right under my name, someone had added another line. Not a title, not a family role, just 5 words. The old lady paying for everything. For a moment, I thought my eyes had betrayed me. Maybe I had misread it. Maybe it was some kind of mistake. But the letters were clear. Sharp black ink on thick wedding cardstock. And suddenly the room felt louder. Glasses clinked. People laughed. The band tuned their instruments. No one seemed shocked. Which meant one thing. This wasn't a mistake. Before I continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always love knowing how far these stories travel. My name is Margaret. I'm 67 years old. A widow of 11 years. And until that night, I believe my family respected me. The wedding was being held at a beautiful hotel ballroom. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen rain. White roses covered every table. And soft music floated through the room like something out of a movie. My granddaughter Lily was getting married. She looked radiant that evening. The kind of happiness that makes you forget everything else. I remember watching her walk past me in that dress. For a moment, my chest filled with pride. Because I had helped make this day possible. The venue, the flowers, the photographer, even the honeymoon. I had quietly paid for most of it. Not because anyone forced me. Because family is supposed to support each other. At least, that's what I believed. When Lily asked if I could help with the wedding expenses, she looked embarrassed. I told her not to worry. Grandmothers are allowed to spoil their granddaughters, I said. And I meant it. But as I sat there holding that name tag, something felt different. 2 women at the next table leaned closer to read it. One of them covered her mouth. The other chuckled. Wow, she whispered. So that's the one. I pretended not to hear them. I folded my napkin carefully on my lap. And I smiled. A calm smile. The kind that hides confusion. Across the room, my son Daniel was talking with guests near the bar. He didn't look at me. Not once. His wife Claire stood beside him. Elegant black dress. Perfect hair. A glass of champagne in her hand. And when her eyes finally met mine, she smiled. A slow smile. The kind that says, yes, I did that. That was the moment I realized something. This wedding wasn't just a celebration. For someone in that room, it was also a joke. And I was the punchline. I kept the smile on my face. Not because I felt calm, but because at my age, you learn something important. When something humiliating happens in public, the worst thing you can do is react immediately. So I simply adjusted the little name card in front of me and turned it slightly. Just enough so fewer people could read the second line. But it didn't really matter. By then, the damage was done. Across the ballroom, the lights dimmed slightly as more guests began to take their seats. The chandeliers above us reflected soft golden light over the white tablecloths. Servers moved quietly between tables carrying trays of champagne. The place looked like something out of a magazine. And yet suddenly, I felt like I was sitting in the middle of a theater. Except I wasn't watching the show. I was the show. 2 men at the table behind me leaned forward. Is that her? One of them whispered. The other nodded. I heard she paid for the whole thing. They didn't whisper quietly enough. And the strange thing was, no one seemed surprised. That's when a cold realization started forming in my chest. People didn't look confused. They looked entertained. Which meant this little message on my name tag wasn't new information. It was already part of the story. A story that had clearly been told before tonight. I folded my hands together on the table and slowly looked around the room. My granddaughter Lily was standing near the stage with her bridesmaids. She was laughing, holding her bouquet, glowing in that soft wedding light. She looked happy, completely happy. And seeing that softened something inside me. Because whatever was happening tonight, I didn't want to ruin her day. At least not yet. Then I noticed Claire again. My daughter-in-law. She was still standing beside my son Daniel near the bar. Claire had always been beautiful in a sharp, polished kind of way. The kind of woman who looked like she stepped out of a real estate advertisement. Perfect posture. Perfect makeup. Perfect smile. And for the past 15 years, she had always been very careful with her words around me. Too careful. The kind of politeness that never quite feels sincere. But tonight something about her expression felt different. Relaxed. Almost satisfied. She took a sip of champagne, leaned closer to Daniel, and said something in his ear. Daniel laughed. Then he looked across the room. Right at me. Our eyes met for half a second. And he quickly looked away. That tiny moment hit harder than the name tag. Because Daniel used to be the kind of son who noticed everything about his mother. When he was little, if I so much as sighed in the kitchen, he would ask what was wrong. When his father died 11 years ago, Daniel held my hand at the funeral and told me, "Don't worry, Mom. You'll never be alone." But tonight, he wouldn't even look at me. A server approached our table and began placing menus in front of the guests. "Dinner service will begin shortly," she said with a warm smile. The woman sitting next to me, a distant cousin from Daniel's side of the family, glanced at my name card again. She hesitated. Then she leaned toward me. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me asking something." Her voice was careful, the kind people use when they think they already know the answer. "What is it?" I asked gently. She lowered her voice. "Did Claire really put that there?" I tilted my head slightly. "What do you mean?" The cousin looked confused. I thought, well, everyone was saying she came up with the seating cards. There it was. The first real clue. Claire had organized the seating, which meant every name card in this ballroom had passed through her hands. I nodded slowly. "That would make sense," I said calmly. The cousin looked uncomfortable now. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I thought maybe it was some kind of joke you two shared." "A joke?" "Yes. That word kept coming up tonight." I smiled politely. "No," I said softly. "We don't share jokes like that." The cousin straightened in her chair, clearly wishing she hadn't brought it up. Around us, the ballroom was filling with noise as guests found their seats. Laughter, glasses clinking, music starting softly again. And yet, the more I listened, the more little fragments of conversation drifted toward me. "She paid for the venue. I heard the honeymoon too. Claire's smart though. Real smart." Each sentence floated past like tiny pieces of a puzzle. And slowly, they began forming a picture. Because the name tag wasn't just an insult. It was a message meant for the entire room. Someone wanted everyone here to know exactly who paid for this wedding. But not in a grateful way. In a mocking way. As if I were nothing more than an old wallet sitting at the table. I picked up the name card again and studied the neat black lettering. The second line had been printed in the same font as my name, which meant something interesting. It hadn't been written by hand. It had been added intentionally, designed, printed, prepared, long before tonight, which meant Claire didn't make that decision at the last minute. She had planned it, days ago, maybe weeks, and somehow, my son had allowed it. That thought hurt more than anything else. But after 67 years of life, I've learned another important lesson. When someone shows you who they are in public, don't argue, don't cry, just watch carefully, because sooner or later, they reveal the rest of the plan. And as I sat there in that glittering ballroom, holding a name tag that turned me into a joke, I had the very strong feeling that tonight's humiliation was only the beginning. I kept turning the name card between my fingers. The paper was thick, expensive. Claire had chosen the wedding stationery carefully. I remembered the day Lily showed me the samples. She had brought 3 different designs to my kitchen table. White roses printed in the corner. Soft gold lettering. Elegant, but not too flashy. Claire had been the one who insisted on the final design. "Presentation matters," she said that afternoon. "People notice the details." She was right. People always notice the details, especially the cruel ones. I set the card back on the table and took a slow breath. Because the longer I sat there, the more one question kept returning to my mind. How did we get here? How did the family I spent my whole life building turn into a room where people laughed at me? The music shifted near the stage as the wedding planner walked across with a clipboard, speaking quietly into a headset. Dinner would start soon. Then, the speeches. Then the dancing. A full evening of celebration. But as I sat there under those glittering chandeliers, memories began replaying in my mind. Because the truth is, none of this started tonight. It started years ago, long before Lily ever got engaged. After my husband Robert passed away, the house felt unbearably quiet. We had lived there for 32 years. The same small brick house, just outside town. Robert built the back porch himself. Every summer he would sit out there with a glass of iced tea, watching the birds at the feeder. When he died, the silence inside that house felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. Daniel started visiting more often during that first year. He would come by after work sometimes, fix things around the house, check the gutters, mow the lawn. At the time, I thought he was just trying to take care of me, and maybe part of him really was. But that was also around the time Claire started showing more interest in my finances. At first it sounded innocent. One evening while we were having dinner together, she asked a simple question. "Margaret, have you thought about long-term planning?" I remember smiling. What kind of planning? She gestured around the house. Well, things like property, savings, retirement accounts. It's important to organize those things early. I laughed softly. Claire, I'm already 65. I've had those things organized for decades. She smiled politely, but something about the look in her eyes felt calculating. You'd be surprised how many older people think that, she said. Older people. Not family. Not Margaret. Just older people. A category. A demographic. At the time, I brushed it off. Claire worked in real estate. Numbers and property were part of her world. But looking back now, that conversation feels different. Because that's when the questions started. Small questions at first. About my mortgage. About my retirement savings. About the value of my house. Claire had a way of asking those questions casually. Like she was just curious. Like she was being helpful. And for a while, I answered them. Because that's what families do. They trust each other. Then 2 years ago, Lily got engaged. The moment Daniel called to tell me the news, I cried. Not sad tears. Happy ones. Lily had always been the light of our family. Sweet. Kind. Gentle. The kind of young woman who still hugged her grandmother every time she walked through the door. When the wedding planning began, the costs added up quickly. Venues. Catering. Flowers. Photography. Anyone who has ever planned a wedding knows how expensive they become. One evening Lily came to visit me. She sat at the same kitchen table where we used to bake cookies when she was little. She looked nervous. Grandma, she said quietly, can I ask you something? I could see the worry on her face immediately. What is it, sweetheart? She hesitated. We're trying to keep the wedding simple, but everything costs so much. She looked down at her hands. I don't want to ask Mom and Dad for more money. They're already stressed. That part surprised me, because Daniel had always done well financially. But Lily continued. Claire keeps saying weddings are investments, and if we do it right, it will help Daniel's reputation with clients. That sentence stuck with me. Reputation with clients. Not Lily's happiness. Not family celebration. Business. Still, I didn't want Lily to worry, so I reached across the table and took her hand. How much do you need? Her eyes widened. Oh no, Grandma, I wasn't asking you for money. I smiled. I know, and I meant it. But the truth was simple. I had spent my whole life saving carefully with Robert. We didn't take expensive vacations. We didn't buy fancy cars. We saved, little by little, year after year. So when I offered to help with the wedding, I didn't think twice. At first it was just the venue, then the flowers, then the catering deposit. Every time another expense appeared, Claire would say the same thing. Well, Margaret did offer to help, and each time I nodded, because seeing Lily happy felt worth it. But sitting here tonight, looking at that name tag calling me the old lady paying for everything, a strange thought finally entered my mind. What if Claire hadn't just accepted my help? What if she had planned on it from the beginning? I sat there staring at the name card while the ballroom slowly filled with people. The band began playing something soft and cheerful near the stage. Waiters moved from table to table pouring water and wine. Guests laughed as if this was the happiest evening of the year. But inside my head, something had started to shift. Because the more I thought about the past 2 years, the more certain details stopped making sense. At the time, I believed I was simply helping my granddaughter have a beautiful wedding. Now I wasn't so sure. I remembered the very first venue Claire showed us. It was a small garden venue outside the city. Lily loved it immediately. It's perfect, she said that day, spinning around on the grass like a child. The place was charming. Not extravagant, but warm and welcoming. Exactly the kind of wedding Lily had always imagined. The manager gave us the price. $20,000. Expensive, yes, but manageable. Lily looked relieved. Daniel nodded. But Claire? Claire frowned. I don't know, she said slowly. It feels a little small. Lily blinked. But I love it. Claire smiled, that careful smile she always used when disagreeing. Of course you do, sweetheart. But weddings are also about impressions. She turned to Daniel. What do you think? Daniel hesitated. Then he shrugged. I guess it is kind of small. Claire nodded immediately, as if that settled the matter. Exactly. A week later, she showed us the ballroom where we were sitting tonight. Crystal chandeliers. Marble floors. A stage big enough for a full band. The price was nearly double the first venue. I remember looking at the brochure and saying gently, that's quite a difference. Claire tilted her head and said something that sounded harmless at the time. Well, Margaret did say she wanted Lily to have the best. At that moment all three of them looked at me. Lily looked embarrassed. Daniel looked uncertain. Claire looked patient, waiting. And because I didn't want Lily to feel guilty about her own wedding, I nodded. Of course, I said. If this is the one she loves. Lily hugged me that day. She hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. Thank you, Grandma. But the strange part came later. Because after that moment, something changed in the way Claire handled the planning. Every decision suddenly became bigger. The flowers Claire chose weren't simple roses anymore. They were imported arrangements. The cake wasn't from the local bakery Lily liked. It was flown in from a famous pastry chef in Chicago. Even the chairs had to be replaced with premium seating. And every time I asked if something was necessary, Claire would smile politely. Well, we want the wedding to look perfect. Then she would add the same sentence she always used. Margaret said she wanted the best. Little by little, the total cost kept rising. 30,000, 40,000, 50,000. Each time I wrote another check, Lily looked more uncomfortable. But Claire always stepped in before she could speak. Don't worry about it, she would say. Your grandmother insists. At the time, I told myself something simple. This is what families do. Grandparents help. Parents support. Everyone comes together for special moments. But now, sitting here in this glittering ballroom with a name tag that mocked me, I remembered another detail. Something small. Something I didn't think much about at the time. 3 months ago, Claire called me one afternoon. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. Margaret, we're finalizing the seating chart, she said. Perfect, I replied. Just put me anywhere near Lily. Claire laughed lightly. Oh, don't worry. We have a special table planned for you. A special table? Yes, she said. You'll love it. I smiled, imagining a quiet place near the front where I could watch Lily during the ceremony. That's what grandmothers usually hope for. But when I arrived tonight, my table was not near the stage. It was near the back of the ballroom, close enough to see everything, far enough that most people wouldn't notice me, except for the name card, the one Claire had designed so carefully. I looked across the room again. Claire was now greeting a group of guests near the entrance. She moved gracefully from person to person, smiling, shaking hands, accepting compliments about the wedding. Every few seconds someone would glance in my direction, then whisper something, then smile again. That was when the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The name tag wasn't just meant to insult me. It was meant to entertain them. Claire hadn't hidden the joke. She had shared it before the wedding even started, which meant the story had already spread through the room. The generous grandmother, the one paying for everything, the old woman who could be laughed at. I felt something inside me grow very still. Not angry. Not yet. Just quiet. Because when humiliation is planned this carefully, it's rarely about one small joke. It's usually about something bigger. And as I watched Claire smiling across the ballroom, I had the strong feeling that tonight's insult was only the opening move in a much larger game. The ballroom continued filling with noise. Glasses clinked. Music drifted through the air. Guests moved between tables greeting each other. If someone had walked into that room without knowing anything, they would have thought it was a perfect wedding. Beautiful decorations. Elegant guests. A joyful family celebration. But once you've noticed something wrong, you start noticing more. I kept my posture straight in the chair and watched quietly. Because at 67 years old, I've learned something useful. When people believe you're harmless, they stop hiding things. A group of women walked past my table. One of them slowed down slightly as she read my name card. She covered her mouth and laughed under her breath. Claire is savage, she whispered. The others giggled. Savage. That word echoed in my mind. They didn't sound shocked. They sounded impressed. As if this entire situation were some clever piece of entertainment. For the first time that evening, I felt a sharp pinch in my chest. Not because strangers were laughing, but because someone in my own family had made sure they would. I picked up my water glass and took a small sip. Across the ballroom, Lily was still moving between groups of guests with her bridesmaids. She looked radiant, completely unaware. Or at least, I hoped she was unaware. Because if Lily had known about the name tag, that would have broken something inside me. Just then, someone approached my table. Grandma. I looked up. It was Lily. Her veil floated lightly over her shoulders as she leaned down to hug me. Hi, sweetheart, I said softly. She smelled like fresh flowers and perfume. The same little girl who used to run through my backyard chasing butterflies now stood in front of me, wearing a wedding dress. Are you having a good time? She asked. I studied her face carefully. There was no mischief in her expression. No hidden joke. Just warmth. Which told me something important. She probably didn't know. I'm enjoying watching you, I said. You look beautiful. She smiled, relieved. Thank you, Grandma. Then her eyes drifted downward toward the table, toward the name card. For a split second, her smile froze. Her eyebrows pulled together slightly. What is that? She asked quietly. Her voice had changed. Just a little. The kind of tone people use when something suddenly feels wrong. I tilted my head. My name card. Lily picked it up slowly. She read the second line, and her face drained of color. That's not funny, she whispered. She looked up immediately. Who did that? The fact that she asked the question told me something else. She hadn't seen it before, and she definitely hadn't approved it. I placed my hand gently over hers. It's all right, I said calmly. No, it's not, she said quickly. Her voice was still quiet, but I could hear anger growing underneath. Grandma, this is awful. She looked across the ballroom, toward her parents, toward Claire. Did Mom do this? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked a simple question. Who organized the seating cards? Lily's eyes widened slightly. Oh, that one word carried everything. Because she already knew the answer. Claire. Lily lowered her voice even further. I didn't see the final seating chart, she admitted. Mom said she would handle it. Of course she did. Claire always handled the details. The important details. The ones that shaped how people saw things. Lily shook her head, still holding the card. I'm going to talk to her. I gently squeezed her hand. No, I said. She looked surprised. But Grandma, not tonight. Lily frowned. But she embarrassed you. I smiled softly. My dear, if this was meant to embarrass me, it failed. That wasn't entirely true. But it was true enough. Because embarrassment fades quickly. What matters more is understanding why something happened. Lily looked torn. Part of her wanted to defend me. Part of her didn't want drama at her own wedding. Finally, she leaned down and hugged me again. I'm really sorry, she whispered in my ear. I didn't know. I believe you, I said. And I did. Because Lily had never learned Claire's talent for cruelty. Before she stepped away, she looked at the name card again. Then she flipped it over so the writing faced down. There, she said. That's better. She kissed my cheek and walked back toward the stage. For a moment, I simply watched her go. But something important had just happened. Because Lily wasn't the only one who had seen the card. Several guests nearby had been watching the entire exchange. And now the whispers had started again. Only this time, the tone was different. Curious. Uneasy. As if people were suddenly wondering whether the joke had gone too far. And just as I was thinking about that, another chair beside my table moved. Someone sat down quietly. Margaret, a familiar voice said. I turned. It was Harold Whitman, my husband Robert's old friend. Harold had been our family lawyer for nearly 30 years. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at me. Then he glanced briefly at the upside-down name card on the table. His expression hardened slightly. I assume, he said calmly, that little message was not your idea. I looked at Harold Whitman sitting beside me. For a moment, I almost laughed at the timing. Out of all the people who could have taken the empty chair at my table tonight, it was the one man who had known my family longer than almost anyone else in that room. Harold had been Robert's friend long before he became our lawyer. They played golf together every summer, argued about baseball every fall. And when Robert passed away 11 years ago, Harold was the one who helped me handle all the paperwork that comes after death. The kind of paperwork no one ever wants to think about. Wills, property, accounts, the quiet, serious business of protecting what a family leaves behind. Harold adjusted his glasses and looked again at the name card lying upside down in front of me. I assume, he repeated calmly, that message was not your idea. I smiled faintly. No, Harold. I can't take credit for that bit of creativity. His mouth tightened slightly. He turned the card over with 2 fingers and read the line. The old lady paying for everything. For a few seconds he didn't say anything. Then he slowly placed the card back on the table. Well, he said quietly, that's remarkably tacky. Coming from Harold Whitman, that was the equivalent of shouting. He wasn't a man who used dramatic language. If Harold called something tacky, it meant he considered it extremely inappropriate. Across the ballroom, I could see Claire greeting more guests near the entrance. Harold followed my gaze. Her doing, he asked. That would be my guess. He nodded once. I suspected as much. I turned to him. You suspected? Harold folded his hands together on the table. Yes. He looked around briefly to make sure no one nearby was listening. Then he leaned slightly closer. Margaret, I wasn't sure whether I should bring this up tonight, but seeing that card makes me think perhaps I should. Something in his voice made my stomach tighten. Because Harold Whitman was not a man who spoke carelessly. If he said something needed to be discussed, it usually meant there was a reason. What is it? I asked. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Have Daniel and Claire spoken to you recently about your house? The question landed like a small stone dropped into still water. My house. I repeated. Yes. I shook my head slowly. Not recently. Harold nodded. That's interesting. Why? He adjusted his glasses again. Because about 6 weeks ago, Claire contacted my office. That made me sit up straighter. Your office? Yes. What did she want? Harold's expression became thoughtful. She said she was calling on Daniel's behalf. That sentence alone was enough to make my chest tighten. What exactly did she ask? I said quietly. Harold glanced toward the dance floor where guests were beginning to gather. Then he lowered his voice further. She asked about the legal process for transferring property between family members. For a moment, the noise of the ballroom seemed to fade slightly around me. Transferring property? I repeated. Yes. To whom? That was the interesting part. Harold picked up his water glass, but didn't drink. She asked how difficult it would be to transfer ownership of a home from a parent to their adult child. My fingers tightened slightly around my napkin. And what did you tell her? I told her exactly what I tell anyone asking that question. He looked at me carefully. That the homeowner must initiate the process themselves. Meaning me. Not Claire. Not Daniel. Only me. And how did she respond? I asked. Harold gave a small shrug. She seemed disappointed. That word hung in the air between us. Disappointed. As if something she hoped would be easy wasn't. I didn't think much of it at the time, Harold continued. Family members ask questions like that occasionally. But, he gave me a long look. But now I'm sitting at a wedding where someone printed a name card mocking the woman who paid for the entire event. His voice remained calm, but I could hear the meaning behind it. And that makes me wonder, he finished. Wonder what? Harold leaned back slightly in his chair. Whether tonight's little joke might be connected to something else. I felt a slow chill move down my spine. Because suddenly, the past few months began rearranging themselves in my mind. Small comments Claire had made. Questions about the house. Daniel mentioning how large the property was. Claire suggesting once that the neighborhood had become very valuable. At the time, those comments seemed harmless. But now, with Harold sitting beside me, and that name card lying on the table, they started forming a different picture. One I didn't particularly like. Harold, I said quietly. Yes. Do you think Claire called you because she believed my house would eventually belong to Daniel? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked directly at me. Margaret, he said gently. Most people assume that family property will eventually pass to the next generation. That's normal. But assumptions, he added, are not the same thing as legal reality. I held his gaze. Meaning? He smiled slightly. Meaning the house still belongs entirely to you. I nodded slowly. Of course it did. Robert and I had bought it together. And after he passed away, everything transferred to me. That had never changed. Yet for some reason, Claire seemed very interested in the idea that it might. Harold placed both hands on the table and looked around the ballroom again. Then he said something that made the entire evening feel suddenly different. Margaret, he said quietly, have you reviewed your will recently? Harold's question stayed in the air between us. Have you reviewed your will recently? For a moment, I simply stared at him. Not because the question was shocking, but because it felt oddly timed. We were sitting at my granddaughter's wedding reception. Music was playing. Guests were laughing. Waiters were placing plates of salad on the tables. And yet suddenly the conversation beside me had shifted to something much more serious. My will, I said quietly. Harold nodded. Yes. I leaned back slightly in my chair. I made my will right after Robert passed away, I said. You helped me with it, remember? Of course I remember. And nothing has really changed since then, I added. At least, that was what I had always believed. Harold folded his hands together again. Margaret, he said gently, when Robert died, your will was structured very simply. I nodded. I remember. Back then, everything had felt overwhelming. Funeral arrangements, bank accounts, insurance papers, 1,000 small decisions that suddenly fall on one person when a spouse disappears from the world. Harold had sat across from me in his office and helped organize everything. And in the end, the will had been straightforward. Most of my estate would go to my son Daniel. Some smaller amounts would go to Lily and a few charities Robert cared about. At the time, that seemed perfectly natural. Daniel was my only child. Of course he would eventually inherit the house. Of course he would receive most of what Robert and I had built together. That's how families usually work. I haven't looked at it in years, I admitted. Harold nodded slowly. That's what I thought. A waiter placed a salad plate in front of me. I barely noticed, because now my attention was completely focused on Harold. Why are you asking? I said. He adjusted his glasses again. Well, when Claire called my office 6 weeks ago, she mentioned something interesting. I felt my stomach tighten slightly. What was that? She said Daniel believed the house was already essentially his. The word sounded strange. Essentially his. Yes. Harold's voice remained calm, but I could hear the concern behind it. She seemed to believe that once certain paperwork was completed, ownership could be transferred rather quickly. I frowned. What paperwork? That, Harold said carefully, was not entirely clear. For a moment neither of us spoke. Across the ballroom the music grew louder as more guests stood and began mingling between tables. Somewhere near the bar someone laughed loudly. The wedding continued around us like nothing unusual was happening. But inside my mind, the pieces were beginning to move again. Claire calling Harold's office. Questions about property transfers. Daniel believing the house was essentially his. And then tonight, the name card. The old lady paying for everything. It didn't feel like a random insult anymore. It felt like part of a story where I had already been assigned a role. The role of the generous grandmother. The harmless old woman. The one who pays for things. And eventually, steps aside. Harold, I said quietly. Yes. Is there any situation where my house could be transferred without me knowing? His answer came immediately. No, that word felt reassuring. But Harold didn't stop there. However, he added, there are situations where families begin making assumptions about property long before anything actually happens. Assumptions. Yes, that seemed to be the key word tonight. Claire assuming my money would fund the wedding. Daniel assuming the house would one day belong to him. And perhaps, both of them assuming I would never question any of it. Harold glanced again at the name card on the table. May I ask something, Margaret? Of course. Did Daniel know you were paying for most of this wedding? I gave a small, tired smile. Yes. Did he object? No, Harold nodded slowly. That's unfortunate. Why? He looked directly at me. Because sometimes people who believe they're already entitled to something begin treating the current owner differently. That sentence landed quietly, but its meaning was sharp. Across the ballroom, I could see Claire again. She was laughing with 2 women near the dance floor, holding her champagne glass like a trophy. Perfect posture. Perfect smile. Perfect confidence. The confidence of someone who believed everything was going according to plan. And for the first time that evening, a different thought crossed my mind. What if Claire believed this house already belonged to Daniel? Not legally, but eventually. Which meant she might already be planning for that future. The same way she planned every detail of this wedding. Every flower. Every chair. Every name card. I picked up the name card again and looked at the cruel little sentence printed under my name. The old lady paying for everything. Slowly, I placed it back on the table. Then I turned to Harold. Harold, I said quietly. Yes. I think Claire may believe she understands my plans. He raised an eyebrow slightly. And does she? I watched Claire laughing across the room. Then I smiled faintly. No, I said. I don't think she does. For a long moment, Harold and I simply sat there in silence. The wedding reception continued around us. The band had switched to something more upbeat. Guests were finishing their salads, and waiters were beginning to clear the plates. Laughter echoed across the ballroom as people stood up to greet friends at other tables. From the outside, everything looked normal. But inside my mind, something had shifted. Because once you begin looking at people differently, you start seeing things you missed before. I looked again toward Claire. She was standing near the center of the room now, speaking with a group of guests who looked like Daniel's business associates. That wasn't unusual. Claire loved making connections. But something about the way she was speaking caught my attention. She gestured toward the decorations, then toward the stage, then toward the ceiling chandeliers. One of the men laughed and said something that made the entire group turn and glance briefly across the room, in my direction. Then they smiled. Not politely, knowingly. I slowly leaned back in my chair. Harold noticed the direction of my gaze. What is it? He asked quietly. I think Claire has been telling a story tonight, I said. He followed my eyes toward the group. What kind of story? The kind where I play a very specific role. Harold glanced again at the name card on the table. The generous grandmother? I shook my head slightly. No, the foolish one. Because suddenly the entire evening made sense. The seating card wasn't just a joke. It was part of a narrative. Claire had already told people about the wedding expenses. She had already explained who paid for what. And she had clearly presented it in a way that made the situation sound amusing. An old woman funding a luxury wedding. A harmless family story. The kind people laugh about over champagne. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something else. Claire wasn't just humiliating me. She was setting a precedent. If everyone in this room believed I was the kind of grandmother who happily paid for everything, then no one would question it later. Not the wedding. Not the next expense. Not even the house. I turned back to Harold. Tell me something honestly, I said. Of course. If someone believed they would eventually inherit a property, would it benefit them to build a story about the current owner being generous with money? Harold considered the question. Yes, he said slowly. It might. Why? Because it normalizes the idea that resources flow in one direction. From me to them, I said. He nodded. Exactly. That was when the final piece clicked into place. Claire hadn't just been planning a wedding. She had been shaping a perception. A perception that Margaret, the harmless grandmother, was always happy to provide. Always happy to give. Always happy to step aside. And if that story became widely accepted, then one day, when something bigger changed, no one would question it. Not even Daniel's friends. Not even the extended family. Because in their minds, the narrative would already be established. The generous, old woman. The one who pays for everything. I let out a quiet breath. For a moment, I actually felt impressed. It was clever. Cruel. But clever. Harold watched my expression carefully. You've realized something, he said. Yes. And I folded my hands together calmly on the table. I think Claire believes she's playing a long game. Harold raised an eyebrow. And is she? Oh yes. Across the ballroom, Claire lifted her champagne glass in a small toast with the group she was speaking to. They laughed again. Someone clapped her on the shoulder. Claire looked radiant. Confident. Completely certain of herself. But there was just one problem with her plan. She believed I didn't see it. And people who think they are the smartest person in the room often make a very predictable mistake. They reveal more than they should. Harold leaned closer again. Margaret, he said quietly. Yes. If you believe something inappropriate is happening, we should discuss it privately another time. I smiled faintly. Oh, we will. After the wedding. But as I said those words, I felt something inside me settle. A calm I hadn't expected when the evening began. Because humiliation can be painful. But clarity is powerful. And tonight had given me something very valuable. The first clear look at Claire's intentions. She believed she was slowly guiding the story of our family toward a future she wanted. A future where Daniel's inheritance was guaranteed. Where the house eventually became theirs. Where Margaret, the old lady paying for everything, quietly disappeared from the center of the picture. I glanced once more at the name card. Then I turned it upside down again. And for the first time that evening, I smiled. Because Claire had spent months planning her little game. But what she didn't know yet was that I had just started planning mine. I kept my smile calm. That's the strange thing about reaching a certain age. When you're younger, humiliation makes you react quickly. You argue. You defend yourself. You demand explanations. But when you've lived long enough, you understand something else. People who try to embarrass you in public are usually expecting a reaction. They want tears, anger, drama, because reactions make their story more entertaining. So I didn't give Claire any of that. Instead, I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate and looked toward the dance floor where guests were beginning to gather for the first dance. The band had shifted into a slow, romantic song. Lily and her new husband stepped onto the floor together. Applause filled the ballroom. For a moment, everyone's attention moved away from the tables and toward the couple. And that gave me a little space to think. Harold was still sitting beside me, quietly observing the room. You look very calm, he said after a moment. I am. That surprises me. I smiled slightly. Why? Because most people would be furious about that name card. I glanced down at it again. The card isn't the real issue, I said. Harold tilted his head. What is? The assumption behind it. He nodded slowly. Yes. I thought you might say something like that. The band continued playing while Lily and her husband moved across the dance floor. The room softened for a moment, the way wedding receptions always do during the first dance. But my mind was already several steps ahead. Because once you understand someone's plan, you have two choices: ignore it or respond to it. And I have never been very good at ignoring things. Harold, I said quietly. Yes. If someone wanted to change the structure of their estate plan, how difficult would that be? He gave a small smile. Legally speaking? Yes. Not difficult at all. I nodded. And if someone wanted to make that change quickly, that could also be arranged. His eyes studied my face carefully. You're thinking about updating your will? Yes. That might be wise, he said. For a moment we both watched the dance floor. Lily looked radiant as she turned slowly under the soft lights. Seeing her happy still mattered to me. That hadn't changed. But happiness and clarity can exist at the same time. And tonight had given me a great deal of clarity. Across the room, Claire stood near the bar again, speaking with Daniel. She leaned toward him and whispered something that made him laugh. Then she glanced in my direction. Our eyes met. Her smile widened slightly. That same confident smile. The one that said she believed everything was under control. I returned the smile. Calm, polite, and completely unreadable. Because Claire was expecting something very different from me tonight. She was expecting the generous grandmother. The harmless, old woman who paid for things. The woman who quietly accepted being the joke of the evening. But people sometimes forget something important about older women. We've had decades to learn patience. Decades to watch how people behave. Decades to understand when someone is playing games. And once you see the game clearly, you can choose how to respond. I leaned slightly toward Harold. There's something else I'd like to ask, I said. Of course. If I decided to make some changes, how quickly could we meet? Harold checked his watch briefly. My office opens at 9 tomorrow morning. That's soon. He nodded. If it's important. I thought about that for a moment. Tomorrow morning. The day after this wedding. A quiet office. A private conversation. It sounded perfect. Yes, I said. I think tomorrow would be good. Harold smiled slightly. I'll make sure the paperwork is ready. I nodded. Then I reached into my purse and took out my phone. Harold raised an eyebrow. You're not calling my office now, are you? I laughed softly. No, this is someone else. Across the ballroom, the music ended, and the guests applauded as Lily and her husband finished their dance. The room filled with cheerful noise again. No one noticed the quiet conversation happening at the back table. I stepped a few feet away from the table before making the call. The line rang twice before someone answered. Hello. Good evening, I said calmly. It's Margaret. There was a brief pause. Oh, Margaret, I didn't expect to hear from you tonight. I know, I said gently. But I have a quick question. Of course. I glanced across the ballroom once more. Claire was still laughing with her group of guests, completely unaware. And that made the moment strangely satisfying. Tell me something, I said into the phone. If someone wanted to review their financial accounts first thing tomorrow morning, would that be possible? The person on the other end of the line didn't hesitate. Absolutely. Good, I said, because I think it's time I looked at everything again. When I ended the call, I felt something settle inside my chest. Not anger, not revenge, just clarity. Because tonight had revealed something important. Claire believed she had months, maybe years, to slowly guide our family's future in the direction she wanted. But starting tomorrow morning, that timeline was about to change. By the time I returned to my seat, the energy in the ballroom had changed. Dinner plates had been cleared away. Wine glasses were being refilled. The band had shifted to a livelier tune as people began moving toward the dance floor. It was the part of every wedding reception where people start relaxing. The speeches had ended. The formalities were over. Now the evening belonged to laughter and celebration. But something else was about to happen, and no one in that room knew it yet. I sat back down at the table beside Harold. Well, he asked quietly. The call is made, I said. He nodded once. Good. Across the room, Daniel was walking toward the stage where the microphone had been set up earlier for the speeches. Claire followed close behind him. Her hand rested lightly on his arm as they walked. She looked pleased, almost glowing. And when Daniel stepped up to the microphone, the band slowly lowered the music. Guests began turning their chairs toward the stage. Someone clinked a fork against a glass. A few people cheered. Daniel tapped the microphone. All right, everyone, he said with a grin. The room grew quiet. I know we already had the official speeches earlier, but I just wanted to say one more thing before the dancing really gets started. A few guests laughed. Claire stood beside him, holding a champagne glass. Her smile was bright, confident. Daniel continued. Tonight has been incredible, he said. Lily and Jason are starting their lives together, and this wedding turned out even better than we imagined. Applause spread through the room. Claire nodded proudly beside him. And of course, Daniel added with a laugh, none of this would have been possible without a little help from family. There it was. The moment Claire had been building toward all evening. I watched her expression carefully. She tilted her head slightly, smiling at the crowd. Waiting. Daniel lifted his glass and looked toward the back of the room. Toward me. My mother Margaret has always been incredibly generous. Some guests clapped politely. Others glanced toward my table. Daniel chuckled into the microphone. In fact, if you've been looking at the name cards tonight, you might have noticed a little joke Claire came up with. Laughter rippled across several tables. Exactly the reaction Claire had hoped for. Daniel continued. She said we should all remember who the real sponsor of the evening is. More laughter. I could see Claire's shoulders relax. She believed the room was enjoying the story. But then something interesting happened. The laughter wasn't as loud as she expected, because several people had already seen Lily's reaction earlier, and a few had noticed Harold sitting beside me. The tone of the room had shifted slightly, not enough for Daniel to notice, but enough that I did. Daniel raised his glass. So let's all give a round of applause to the old lady paying for everything. A few people clapped. A few laughed, but the sound felt uneven, because at that exact moment, I stood up. Chairs scraped softly across the floor as people near my table turned to look. Daniel froze slightly at the microphone. He clearly hadn't expected me to move, but I simply smiled and lifted my own glass. Daniel, I said calmly. My voice wasn't loud, but the microphone carried the silence of the room, and suddenly everyone was watching. Yes, Mom, he said. I looked around the ballroom, at the chandeliers, at the guests, at Claire. Then I spoke clearly. You're absolutely right. A few people shifted in their seats. Claire's smile widened again. She thought I was playing along. I continued. I have been very generous with this wedding. Polite applause started again, but I raised one hand gently. However, I said, there's something I'd like to clarify. The room grew quieter, because now people sensed something unusual was happening. I glanced toward Harold briefly, then back to Daniel. You see, I continued calmly. Generosity is a wonderful thing, but it should never be confused with foolishness. The laughter stopped completely. Claire's smile faltered, just slightly. Daniel shifted his weight at the microphone. Mom, I spoke again before he could finish. And since tonight seems to be a night for sharing family stories, I lifted my glass slightly. I thought I might share a small update as well. Claire's eyes narrowed. She didn't like surprises, especially not public ones. I kept my voice calm. As of tomorrow morning, I said clearly, I will be reviewing every financial account, every legal document, and every property decision connected to my estate. The room went completely silent, because suddenly, this was no longer a joke. Daniel blinked at the microphone. Claire's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips, and I finished the sentence slowly. With my lawyer. I glanced toward Harold. Several guests followed my gaze. Harold gave a small nod, and that was the moment the entire atmosphere in the ballroom changed. Because Claire finally understood something she hadn't expected. The old lady paying for everything was no longer playing her role. For a few seconds after I finished speaking, the ballroom was completely silent. Not the comfortable silence you sometimes hear during a wedding. This one felt different. Heavy. Uncertain. Because suddenly the story Claire had been telling all evening didn't make sense anymore. Daniel stood frozen behind the microphone. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Claire was the first one to move. She stepped forward beside him, still holding her champagne glass. Her smile returned, but this time it looked strained. "Oh, Margaret," she said with a soft laugh. The kind of laugh people use when they're trying to smooth over something awkward. "You don't need to make this so serious tonight." Several guests shifted in their chairs. Claire continued. "This is a wedding. Everyone is just having fun." Her voice carried a gentle, reassuring tone, as if I were a confused grandmother who had misunderstood a joke. For years, that tactic probably worked very well for her. But tonight something was different. Because too many people in the room had already noticed the tension. Too many had seen Lily's reaction earlier. And too many had heard Daniel proudly repeat the line from the name card. The old lady paying for everything. I kept my expression calm. I'm not upset, Claire, I said gently. Daniel finally spoke again into the microphone. Mom, maybe we can talk about this later. His voice sounded nervous now. A few people nodded, clearly hoping the moment would pass. But I shook my head slightly. There's nothing to argue about. I lifted my glass again. I only wanted to make one thing clear. Claire's smile faded a little more. And what's that? She asked. I spoke slowly so everyone could hear. Paying for a wedding does not mean giving away the rest of my life's work. The sentence hung in the air, because everyone in the room understood exactly what I meant. Claire's expression tightened. Margaret, she said carefully, no one said that. No, I replied. But someone seemed very interested in discussing my house with my lawyer. That sentence landed like a stone in the center of the room. Claire blinked. Just once. A tiny movement most people might have missed. But I didn't. Daniel turned slightly toward her. What is she talking about? Claire recovered quickly. I have no idea, she said lightly. But Harold's calm voice suddenly spoke from my table. Actually, he said, I believe she's referring to a call your wife made to my office 6 weeks ago. Every head in the ballroom seemed to turn at once. Because Harold Whitman wasn't just anyone. Most of the older guests knew him. He had been the town's most respected attorney for decades. Daniel frowned. Claire. She forced a small laugh. Oh, please. I just asked a general question about estate planning. Harold nodded politely. That is correct. For a moment Claire relaxed. Then Harold added quietly. However, the question specifically involved transferring ownership of Margaret's house. The air seemed to tighten across the room. Daniel looked confused. You asked about Mom's house? Claire's voice sharpened slightly. It was just a conversation. But something had already changed. Because people were no longer laughing. They were watching. Very carefully. And Claire hated being watched when she wasn't controlling the narrative. I spoke again, still calmly. There's nothing wrong with asking questions. Claire looked at me cautiously. That's right, she said quickly. There isn't. I nodded. But there is something wrong with planning someone else's future without their knowledge. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the band members near the stage had stopped adjusting their instruments. Daniel looked back and forth between us. Mom. Claire, what is going on? Claire took a step toward the microphone. Daniel, this is ridiculous. But Lily's voice suddenly came from near the dance floor. Mom. Everyone turned. Lily had stepped forward, still in her wedding dress. Her expression wasn't angry, just deeply disappointed. Did you really put that message on Grandma's name card? She asked. Claire hesitated. Only for a second. But it was enough. Lily shook her head slowly. That wasn't funny. Claire opened her mouth to respond. But I spoke first. It doesn't matter anymore, I said gently. Because the truth had already done its work. The room understood. The joke. The assumptions. The quiet planning behind my back. I lifted my glass one last time. Lily, I said softly. Yes, Grandma. Tonight is your wedding. She nodded. And you deserve to enjoy it. I set my glass down on the table. Then I turned toward Daniel. For the record, I said calmly, I have no intention of giving away my house. Daniel looked stunned. Claire's face had gone pale. And I finished with the same calm voice I had used all evening. But tomorrow morning, I said, I will be making sure my plans are very clear. The silence that followed was louder than any applause. Because in that moment, Claire finally understood something. The old lady she had been laughing about was not nearly as easy to control as she thought. Part 12. Walking away with dignity for several long seconds after I finished speaking, no one in the ballroom moved. The silence had weight to it now. Not confusion. Understanding. People were looking at Claire differently. They were looking at Daniel differently. And for the first time that evening, no one was laughing. Daniel slowly stepped away from the microphone. His face looked pale. Mom, he said quietly. But he didn't finish the sentence. Because there wasn't really anything he could say. The truth had already been spoken. Claire, on the other hand, still tried to recover. She forced a small smile and lifted her champagne glass again. Everyone, she said lightly. Let's not turn this into family drama. But the room didn't respond. Not the way it had earlier. Because people had already seen enough. The joke. The name card. The lawyer. The conversation about my house. And the moment Lily stepped forward in her wedding dress had changed everything. Lily walked slowly toward my table. Her heels made soft sounds against the marble floor. When she reached me, her eyes were shiny with emotion. Grandma, she said quietly. I'm so sorry. I reached for her hands. They were warm and trembling. You have nothing to apologize for, I told her. But this happened at my wedding, she whispered. I smiled gently. No, I said. This happened because some people forgot what family means. Lily looked toward her parents. Claire stood stiffly beside Daniel now. Her confident posture had disappeared, and Daniel looked like a man realizing something far too late. I squeezed Lily's hands. Sweetheart, tonight is still your night. She shook her head slightly. I don't want you leaving like this. I chuckled softly. Oh, I'm not leaving because I'm upset. I stood up from the table. My chair slid quietly across the floor. I'm leaving because I've seen enough for one evening. A few guests shifted in their seats. Harold stood beside me. Margaret, he said gently, would you like me to walk you out? That would be lovely. Daniel finally stepped forward from the stage. Mom, wait. His voice carried through the quiet room. I turned to look at him. For the first time that evening, he looked less like a confident host and more like the boy I had raised. Can we talk? He asked. Of course we can, I said calmly. Just not tonight. Claire finally spoke again. Her voice had lost its smooth charm. This is being blown completely out of proportion. But no one was listening to her anymore. That was the strange thing about truth. Once it enters a room, it doesn't leave easily. I picked up my purse from the back of the chair. Then I turned once more toward Lily. She wrapped her arms around me tightly. I love you, Grandma, she whispered. I love you too. I kissed her cheek. And nothing that happened tonight changes that. When we stepped apart, I looked across the ballroom one last time. The chandeliers still glowed above the tables. The flowers still filled the air with their sweet scent. It was still a beautiful wedding. But the story Claire had planned for the evening had ended very differently. I looked toward Daniel. Tomorrow morning, I said calmly, I'll be meeting with Harold. He nodded slowly. I understand. Then my eyes moved to Claire. For the first time all night, she didn't smile. She simply watched me, trying to understand how her carefully planned story had fallen apart. I gave her a polite nod. Good night, Claire. She didn't answer. Harold walked beside me as we moved toward the ballroom doors. Guests quietly stepped aside to let us pass. Some nodded politely. Others avoided eye contact. But one thing was clear. No one was laughing anymore. When we reached the doors, the cool night air flowed into the hallway outside. The music from the ballroom faded behind us. Harold looked at me. You handled that with remarkable grace, he said. I smiled. Well, Robert always said something. What was that? I paused before answering. He said dignity is the one thing people can't take from you, unless you hand it to them. Harold chuckled softly. That sounds like Robert. We walked slowly toward the exit of the hotel. Through the large windows, I could still see the lights of the ballroom glowing behind us. Somewhere inside, the wedding would continue. The dancing, the music, the celebration. And that was exactly how it should be. Because Lily deserved happiness on her wedding night. But tomorrow morning, things would be different. My accounts would be reviewed. My will would be updated. And the future Claire believed she had already secured would no longer exist. Harold opened the hotel doors for me. The cool evening breeze touched my face. For the first time that entire night, I felt something lighter inside my chest. Relief. Not anger. Not revenge. Just relief. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply stand up, tell the truth, and walk away. I stepped outside into the quiet night. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely free.